Picture a man who never traveled more than 60 miles from his birthplace, yet whose thoughts journeyed to the furthest reaches of human understanding. A professor so punctual that townspeople set their clocks by his daily walks, yet whose revolutionary ideas shattered the foundations of centuries-old philosophical certainties. This is Immanuel Kant, the quiet revolutionary who transformed how we understand knowledge, morality, and the very nature of human experience. Born in 1724 in Königsberg, East Prussia, Kant lived through one of history's most transformative periods, the Enlightenment. While revolutions raged across continents and new scientific discoveries reshaped humanity's understanding of the cosmos, Kant embarked on his own revolution in the realm of pure thought. His mission wasn't to conquer territories or discover new lands, but to map the territories of human reason itself and establish the limits and possibilities of what we can truly know. If you're finding value in these philosophical explorations, I genuinely appreciate a like or subscribe. Your support means everything. I'm always fascinated to know where our community spans, so share in the comments what city you're tuning in from and what time it is there. It's incredible seeing our global philosophical family connect through these timeless ideas. Now settle in. Maybe adjust your lighting and find that perfect, comfortable spot, and let's embark on tonight's intellectual adventure together. We're about to discover why Kant fundamentally changed how we understand the relationship between mind and reality, between what we can know and what we must believe, between the world as it appears to us and the world as it truly is. Part 1. The Critical Turn. Kant's philosophical journey began with what he called his dogmatic slumber, a period when he accepted the dominant philosophical traditions without question. Like most intellectuals of his time, he initially embraced rationalism, the view that reason alone could unlock the deepest truths about reality. Rationalists like Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz believed that through pure logical deduction, starting from self-evident principles, we could discover fundamental truths about God, the soul, and the nature of existence itself. This comfortable philosophical worldview was shattered when Kant encountered the writings of David Hume, the Scottish skeptic who demonstrated that many of our most basic beliefs about causation, the external world, and even our own identity could not be justified through reason or experience alone. Hume showed that when we see one billiard ball strike another and the second ball move, we never actually observe the causal connection between these events. We only see temporal succession and spatial contiguity. Our belief in causation, Hume argued, is merely a habit of mind formed through repeated observation, not a rational insight into the nature of reality. This revelation, Kant later wrote, awakened me from my dogmatic slumber and forced him to confront fundamental questions about the nature and limits of human knowledge. If Hume was correct, then the entire Enlightenment project of using reason to understand reality was built on shaky foundations. Yet Kant couldn't accept Hume's skeptical conclusions, particularly the implication that mathematical and scientific knowledge, which seemed so certain and universal, was merely contingent and uncertain. Kant spent over a decade developing his response to this crisis, ultimately producing what he called a critical philosophy that would examine reason itself before attempting to use it to understand the world. His approach was revolutionary. Instead of asking, what can we know about reality, he asked, how is knowledge possible at all? This shift in perspective, from examining objects to examining the conditions that make knowledge of objects possible, became known as Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus had revolutionized astronomy by proposing that the Earth revolves around the Sun rather than vice versa, Kant proposed that objects conform to our knowledge rather than our knowledge conforming to objects. This meant that the fundamental structures we discover in experience, concepts like causation, substance, and unity, are not features of things as they exist independently of us, but rather necessary conditions that our minds impose on experience in order to make knowledge possible. This critical turn had profound implications for understanding the relationship between mind and world. Rather than viewing the mind as a passive recipient of information from an external reality, Kant portrayed it as an active constructor of experience. The mind doesn't simply mirror reality, it shapes and organizes sensory information according to its own inherent structures, making experience intelligible and knowledge possible. The critical philosophy promised to resolve the conflict between rationalism and empiricism by showing that both schools had grasped important truths while missing the crucial role of the mind's active contribution to knowledge. Against the empiricists, Kant argued that experience alone cannot provide the universal and necessary knowledge we find in mathematics and science. Against the rationalists, he maintained that reason cannot transcend the bounds of possible experience to provide knowledge of supersensible realities like God, freedom, and the soul. Part 2. The Architecture of Experience. Kant's analysis of knowledge begins with his famous distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments, and between a priori and a posteriori knowledge. Analytic judgments are those where the predicate is already contained in the subject, like all bachelors are unmarried men. These judgments are necessarily true, but tell us nothing new about the world. Synthetic judgments, by contrast, add new information to our understanding, like the cat is on the mat. These judgments expand our knowledge, but seem to require empirical verification. Traditional philosophy assumed that all a priori knowledge independent of experience, must be analytic, while all synthetic knowledge must be synthetic, be a posteriori, dependent on experience. Kant's crucial insight was recognizing the existence of synthetic a priori judgments, knowledge that is both informative about the world and knowable independently of experience. Mathematical propositions like 7 + 5 = 12 and basic principles of science like every event has a cause fall into this category. The existence of synthetic a priori knowledge posed a fundamental question: how is such knowledge possible? Kant's answer lay in his theory of the transcendental conditions of experience. He argued that certain concepts and principles must be presupposed for experience to be possible at all, and these necessary presuppositions constitute our synthetic a priori knowledge. Kant distinguished between two fundamental sources of knowledge: sensibility and understanding. Sensibility provides the raw material of sensation, while understanding organizes this material into coherent experience through concepts. This partnership between sensibility and understanding makes knowledge possible, but it also limits knowledge to the realm of possible experience. In the Transcendental aesthetic, Kant analyzed the forms of sensibility, space and time. He argued that space and time are not features of things as they exist independently of us, but rather the necessary forms through which we must experience any object whatsoever. Space is the form of outer intuition, while time is the form of inner intuition. This means that everything we experience must appear to us as spatial and temporal, not because space and time are ultimate features of reality, but because they are the necessary conditions under which human sensibility operates. This theory of space and time as transcendental forms of intuition solved several philosophical puzzles. It explained how mathematical knowledge is possible. Geometry describes the necessary structure of space as we must experience it, while arithmetic describes the necessary structure of temporal succession. It also explained why space and time seem to be infinite and infinitely divisible. These are features of the forms of our intuition rather than properties of things in themselves. The Transcendental Analytic examined the role of understanding in organizing sensory intuitions into coherent experience. Kant identified 12 fundamental concepts, or categories, that the understanding must use to synthesize the manifold of sensation into unified objects of experience. These categories include substance, causation, unity, plurality, reality, negation, and others. Like space and time, these categories are not derived from experience but are necessary conditions that make experience possible. The process by which the understanding applies categories to sensory intuitions occurs through what Kant called the transcendental synthesis of imagination. This faculty combines the temporal flow of sensations with the atemporal concepts of understanding, producing the unified objects of experience that we encounter in ordinary consciousness. Without this synthetic activity, we would have neither coherent objects nor unified consciousness. Part 3. The limits of knowledge. Kant's critical philosophy established both the possibility and the limits of human knowledge. While we can have genuine knowledge of the phenomenal world, the world as it appears to us through the forms of sensibility and the categories of understanding, we cannot have knowledge of the noumenal world, things as they exist independently of our cognitive apparatus. This distinction between phenomena and noumena represents one of Kant's most important and controversial doctrines. Phenomena are objects as they appear to us, already structured by the forms of intuition and the categories of understanding. Noumena are things as they might exist in themselves, apart from any relation to human cognition. Kant argued that we can think about noumena but cannot know them, since knowledge requires the application of categories to sensory intuitions, and we have no access to things as they exist independently of our sensory apparatus. The doctrine of unknowable things in themselves has been criticized as either inconsistent or unnecessary. Critics argue that if we truly cannot know anything about things in themselves, then we cannot even know that they exist or that they affect our sensibility. Defenders respond that the concept of things in themselves serves a crucial limiting function, preventing us from making illegitimate claims about the ultimate nature of reality while preserving the objectivity of empirical knowledge. In the Transcendental dialectic, Kant examined what happens when reason attempts to transcend the limits of possible experience. He analyzed 3 traditional areas of metaphysical speculation: rational psychology, the doctrine of the soul; rational cosmology, the doctrine of the world; and rational theology, the doctrine of God. In each case, he demonstrated that pure reason falls into irresolvable contradictions when it attempts to gain knowledge beyond the boundaries of experience. Rational psychology attempts to prove the simplicity, immateriality, and immortality of the soul through pure conceptual analysis. Kant showed that these arguments commit the paralogism of confusing the logical unity of consciousness with the substantial unity of a soul substance. While we must presuppose the unity of consciousness for experience to be possible, this gives us no warrant for concluding that this unity belongs to an immaterial permanent substance. Rational cosmology generates what Kant called the antinomies of pure reason, pairs of contradictory propositions that can each be proven with equal rigor. For example, reason can prove both that the world has a beginning in time and spatial limits, and that the world is infinite in both time and space. These contradictions arise because reason attempts to think the world as a completed totality, which goes beyond what experience can provide. Rational theology attempts to prove God's existence through pure reason, particularly through the ontological, cosmological, and teleological arguments. Kant provided detailed critiques of each argument, showing that they all ultimately depend on the illegitimate assumption that existence is a predicate that can be added to a concept. His famous declaration that existence is not a predicate undermined centuries of attempts to prove God's existence through purely rational means. These criticisms of traditional metaphysics were not intended to promote skepticism, but to clear the ground for a more modest and secure approach to these ultimate questions. By showing the limits of theoretical reason, Kant aimed to make room for faith and open space for practical approaches to questions about God, freedom, and immortality. Part 4. The moral law. While theoretical reason reaches its limits when it encounters questions about God, freedom, and immortality, Kant argued that practical reason as it guides action, provides a different kind of access to these ultimate concerns. His moral philosophy, developed primarily in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals and the critique of practical reason, presents an ethical theory based on the autonomy of rational agents and the categorical imperative. Kant's moral philosophy begins with the observation that nothing in the world or beyond it can be considered unconditionally good except a good will. Intelligence, courage, wealth, and even happiness can be used for evil purposes, but a will that acts from the right motives retains its moral worth regardless of the consequences it produces. This goodwill is characterized by acting from duty rather than inclination, and by recognizing the moral law as a categorical rather than hypothetical imperative. Hypothetical imperatives tell us what we ought to do if we want to achieve certain ends. If you want to be healthy, you should exercise. Categorical imperatives tell us what we ought to do regardless of our particular desires or goals. You ought to tell the truth. Kant argued that genuine moral obligations must be categorical, since moral duties bind us unconditionally, rather than depending on our contingent desires or circumstances. The categorical imperative can be formulated in several ways, each highlighting different aspects of moral duty. The first formulation, known as the universal law formulation, states, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." This test requires us to consider whether we could consistently will everyone to act according to the principle underlying our action. For example, making a false promise fails this test, because if everyone made false promises whenever convenient, the institution of promising would collapse, making false promises impossible. The universalizability test thus rules out actions that are self-defeating when universalized, revealing the inherent rationality of moral constraints. The second major formulation, known as the humanity formulation, states, "Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never merely as a means." This formulation emphasizes the dignity and autonomy of rational beings, prohibiting us from using people merely as tools for our purposes, while requiring us to respect and promote their capacity for rational self-determination. These formulations converge on the idea that morality consists in the self-legislation of reason. Rational beings are autonomous in the sense that they can step back from their immediate desires and inclinations, consider what reason requires, and act accordingly. This autonomy is both the source of moral obligation and the basis of human dignity. Kant's moral philosophy has been criticized for being overly rigid and abstract, demanding that we act from pure duty while ignoring the legitimate role of emotions, relationships, and consequences in moral decision-making. Critics argue that his emphasis on universalizability and treating people as ends leads to moral conclusions that conflict with ordinary moral intuitions and fail to capture the complexity of real moral situations. Defenders respond that Kant's ethics provides a crucial foundation for human rights and dignity that is missing from consequentialist and virtue-based approaches. By grounding morality in the rational nature that all humans share, Kantian ethics supports universal principles of justice and respect that transcend cultural differences and personal preferences. Part 5. Freedom and Determinism. One of the most profound challenges in Kant's philosophy concerns the relationship between moral responsibility and causal determinism. If everything in the natural world, including human behavior, is subject to universal causal laws, how can we be genuinely free and morally responsible for our action? Kant's solution to this problem involves his distinction between the phenomenal and noumenal realms and his doctrine of transcendental idealism. In the phenomenal realm, to Haufer, the world as it appears to us through the forms of sensibility and categories of understanding, everything is subject to the causal necessity that makes scientific knowledge possible. Human actions, viewed from the empirical standpoint, are events in the natural world that can be explained and predicted according to psychological and sociological laws. From this perspective, the idea of absolute spontaneity or uncaused choice seems impossible. However, Kant argued that we must also think of ourselves as noumenal beings, things in themselves that exist beyond the realm of appearances. As noumenal agents, we are not subject to the temporal conditions and causal laws that govern the phenomenal world. This creates the conceptual space for genuine freedom, understood as the capacity to initiate action through reason, rather than being determined by prior causes in the chain of natural events. This two-aspect theory of human agency suggests that the same action can be both causally determined when viewed from the empirical standpoint and free when viewed from the intelligible. A person's decision to help someone in need might be explicable in terms of their upbringing, psychological makeup, while simultaneously being a free expression of their rational will to act according to moral principles. Critics have questioned whether this solution is coherent or whether it simply pushes the problem back to an unknowable realm. If we cannot have theoretical knowledge of ourselves as noumenal agents, how can we know that we are free? And if our noumenal choices somehow influence our phenomenal actions, doesn't this violate the causal closure of the natural world? Kant's response involves distinguishing between different kinds of knowledge and certainty. While we cannot have theoretical knowledge of freedom, since theoretical knowledge is limited to the phenomenal realm, we have practical certainty of our freedom through our immediate awareness of moral obligation. The ought implies can. If we are genuinely obligated to act morally, we must be capable of doing so, which requires genuine freedom. This practical approach to freedom extends to Kant's treatment of other postulates of practical reason. While theoretical reason cannot prove the existence of God or the immortality of the soul, practical reason requires us to postulate these ideas as necessary conditions for the possibility of moral progress and the ultimate unity of virtue and happiness in the highest good. The postulate of God's existence is needed to guarantee that virtue will ultimately be rewarded with proportionate happiness. Since this connection is not guaranteed in the natural world, where the virtuous often suffer while the wicked prosper, the postulate of immortality is needed to provide sufficient time for the infinite progress toward moral perfection that duty demands but finite life cannot accommodate. These postulates represent rational faith rather than knowledge. They are beliefs that practical reason requires us to hold, even though theoretical reason cannot demonstrate their truth. This approach allows Kant to preserve both the scientific worldview, which requires universal causal determinism, and the moral worldview, which requires genuine freedom and cosmic justice, by locating them in different conceptual frameworks. Part 6. Aesthetic Judgment and Teleology. Kant's third major work, The Critique of Judgment, addresses the apparent gap between the natural world described by science and the moral world demanded by ethics. How can we understand ourselves as both natural beings, subject to causal laws, and moral agents capable of freedom? Kant's answer involves examining two kinds of reflective judgment: aesthetic judgment concerning beauty and the sublime, and teleological judgment concerning purpose in nature. Aesthetic judgment differs from both theoretical and practical judgment in important ways. When we judge something beautiful, we are not determining what it is, theoretical judgment, or what we ought to do about it, practical judgment. but rather expressing a unique kind of reflective response to our experience. Beauty involves a harmony between our cognitive faculties, imagination, and understanding that produces a disinterested pleasure that we expect others to share. The judgment of beauty is characterized by 4 moments. Disinterestedness. We appreciate beauty for its own sake rather than for any purpose it serves. Universality. We expect others to agree with our aesthetic judgments. Purposiveness without purpose. Beautiful objects seem designed for our cognitive faculties without serving any definite purpose and necessity. Our aesthetic judgments feel compelled rather than arbitrary. These characteristics of aesthetic judgment suggest that beauty provides a bridge between the natural and moral worlds. In experiencing beauty, we encounter objects that seem designed for our cognitive faculties, suggesting a harmony between mind and nature that goes beyond what mechanical causation alone can explain. This harmony intimates that nature might be organized according to purposes that make room for moral agency and teleological development. The experience of the sublime involves a different kind of aesthetic judgment that confronts us with the limits of sensible experience and points toward our supersensible capacities. The mathematical sublime occurs when we encounter objects so vast that imagination cannot comprehend them as totalities, leading reason to recognize its own superiority to sensible experience. The dynamical sublime occurs when we encounter objects so powerful that they could destroy us physically, leading reason to recognize its own moral independence from natural forces. Both forms of the sublime involve a movement from initial, overwhelming or displeasure to ultimate satisfaction, as reason recognizes its own superiority to the sensible world. This aesthetic experience provides a kind of practical preparation for moral action by helping us recognize our supersensible capacities and our independence from merely natural determination. Teleological judgment addresses the apparent purposiveness we observe in natural organisms and ecosystems. While mechanical causation can explain many natural phenomena, living beings seem to exhibit a kind of organization where the parts exist for the sake of the whole and the whole exists for the sake of the parts. This mutual interdependence suggests a form of natural purpose that cannot be reduced to efficient causation. Kant argued that we cannot prove that natural purposes actually exist, since this would require knowledge of things in themselves that is unavailable to us. However, we cannot help but think of certain natural phenomena as if they were purposively organized, and this regulative use of teleological concepts is necessary for biological science and our understanding of systematic unity in nature. The purposiveness we attribute to nature through reflective judgment suggests that nature might be organized in ways that are conducive to moral development and the realization of human purposes. While we cannot know this theoretically, we can hope that the natural world provides a suitable stage for moral progress and the eventual realization of the highest good. Part 7. Political philosophy and historical progress. Kant's political philosophy extends his moral insights to questions about justice, law, and the organization of human society. His essay, Toward Perpetual Peace, and other political writings develop a vision of legal and international order based on republican government, cosmopolitan right, and the gradual progress of human reason. Kant argued that the only legitimate form of government is one based on the consent of the governed and the rule of law. Republican government, in Kant's sense, involves the separation of powers and representative institutions that ensure laws apply equally to rulers and ruled. This form of government best protects individual freedom while maintaining the social cooperation necessary for human flourishing. The principles of justice that should govern domestic law extend to international relations through what Kant called cosmopolitan right. Just as individuals must leave the state of nature and submit to civil law to escape the cycle of violence and insecurity, nations must eventually establish international legal institutions to resolve conflicts peacefully and protect human rights across borders. Kant's vision of perpetual peace involves 3 definitive articles. republican government within states, a federation of free states to handle international disputes, and cosmopolitan law that protects the rights of individuals as citizens of the world. This institutional framework would gradually reduce the causes of war while promoting trade, communication, and cultural exchange that make peoples more interdependent and less likely to resort to violence. This political program is grounded in Kant's philosophy of history, which sees human development as a gradual process of moral and political progress, driven by the unsocial sociability of human nature. Humans naturally seek society for mutual benefit, but they also compete and conflict in ways that force the development of legal institutions and moral constraints. Through this dialectical process, the very vices that create problems also generate the solutions that promote human development. Kant's historical optimism is tempered by his recognition that progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. The development of reason and moral culture requires sustained effort across generations, and setbacks and reversals are always possible. However, he believed that the overall trajectory of human history points toward greater freedom, justice, and enlightenment. The famous essay, "What is Enlightenment?" articulates Kant's understanding of intellectual and moral maturity as humanity's emergence from self-imposed tutelage. Enlightenment involves the courage to use one's own understanding rather than relying on external authorities, whether religious, political, or traditional. This intellectual independence is both a condition for and a result of moral autonomy. Kant's political philosophy has influenced modern theories of democracy, human rights, and international law. His emphasis on individual autonomy, representative government, and cosmopolitan institutions provides philosophical foundations for liberal democratic theory and international organizations designed to promote peace and protect human rights. Critics have argued that Kant's political theory is too abstract and idealistic to provide practical guidance for real political problems. Others contend that his emphasis on formal procedures and universal principles neglects important considerations of cultural difference, economic inequality, and power relations that shape political life. Part 8. Religion within reason. Kant's philosophy of religion, developed primarily in Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, attempts to reconcile religious faith with moral autonomy and rational criticism. Rather than defending traditional theological doctrines through metaphysical arguments, Kant reinterprets religious concepts in moral terms and argues that authentic religion must be grounded in practical reason rather than theoretical knowledge or revealed authority. Kant began with the observation that human moral experience reveals a fundamental tension between duty and inclination. While reason commands us to act morally, our natural inclinations often pull us towards self-interest and immediate gratification. This conflict suggests what Kant called radical evil, not an inherent corruption of human nature, but a tendency to subordinate moral duty to self-love when the two conflict. The concept of radical evil explains why moral progress is so difficult and why individuals often fail to live up to their own moral standards despite genuine commitment to doing right. This moral struggle is not simply a matter of ignorance or weakness, but reflects a deeper conflict between the rational and sensible aspects of human nature. Kant argued that overcoming radical evil requires what he called a revolution in the disposition, a fundamental reorientation of priorities that places moral duty above self-interest. While this transformation must ultimately be achieved through individual moral effort, Kant recognized that it is facilitated by participation in what he called an ethical community, a voluntary association of morally committed individuals who support each other's moral development. Religious concepts like grace, salvation, and divine assistance can be reinterpreted as representing aspects of this moral transformation that go beyond what purely individual effort can achieve. Grace represents the hope that our sincere moral efforts will be supplemented by forces beyond our control, while salvation represents the ultimate harmony between virtue and happiness that moral reason demands, but empirical experience cannot guarantee. Kant's approach to religious doctrine was both critical and reconstructive. He rejected traditional arguments for God's existence based on theoretical reason, but he affirmed God's reality as a practical postulate necessary for moral life. Similarly, he rejected literal interpretations of religious narratives while finding moral significance in religious symbols and stories. This approach allows religious believers to maintain their faith while subjecting religious claims to rational criticism. Religious doctrines are valuable not because they provide theoretical knowledge about supernatural realities, but because they support and express moral truths that practical reason discovers independently. Kant's philosophy of religion has been influential in modern theology and religious studies, particularly among those who seek to reconcile religious faith with scientific knowledge and moral autonomy. Liberal Protestant theologians have found in Kant's approach a way to preserve the essential insights of Christianity while abandoning supernatural claims that conflict with modern knowledge. Critics argue that Kant's moral reinterpretation of religion evacuates religious faith of its distinctively religious content, reducing theology to ethics, and eliminating the transcendent dimension that makes religion meaningful to most believers. Others contend that his emphasis on moral autonomy is incompatible with the traditional religious emphasis on divine authority and human dependence on God. Part 9. The unity of reason. One of Kant's deepest concerns was establishing the systematic unity of human reason across its theoretical, practical, and aesthetic applications. While the three critiques examine different domains of rational activity, they form parts of a unified philosophical system that reveals the architecture of human reason and its relationship to experience, action, and judgment. The unity of reason appears most clearly in Kant's account of the ideas of reason, God, freedom, and immortality. These ideas emerge naturally from reason's drive towards systematic completeness and ultimate explanation. While theoretical reason cannot establish these ideas as objects of knowledge, they serve crucial regulative functions in guiding inquiry and practical functions in making moral life possible. The idea of God represents the ideal of complete systematic unity that guides theoretical reason in its search for ultimate explanations. While we cannot prove God's existence theoretically, the idea of divine intelligence serves as a regulative principle that encourages us to seek systematic connections in nature and assume that nature is ultimately intelligible to rational inquiry. The idea of freedom represents the possibility of rational self-determination that makes moral responsibility possible. While theoretical reason cannot demonstrate freedom, since it treats everything as causally determined, practical reason requires freedom as a condition for moral obligation. The reality of freedom is thus established practically rather than theoretically. The idea of immortality represents the possibility of infinite moral progress that duty demands, but finite life cannot provide. While theoretical reason cannot prove the soul's immortality, practical reason requires this postulate to make sense of the moral demand for perfect virtue that can never be fully realized in temporal existence. These ideas achieve their ultimate unity in the concept of the highest good, the complete object of practical reason that combines perfect virtue with proportionate happiness. The highest good represents the final end that gives meaning to all moral striving and provides the ultimate purpose that connects individual moral development with cosmic justice. The systematic unity of reason also appears in Kant's account of the architectonic structure of philosophy. Just as reason naturally organizes experience according to systematic principles, philosophical reflection reveals an architectonic structure that connects all the legitimate uses of reason in a coherent system. This systematic approach influenced later German idealists like Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, who attempted to develop even more complete philosophical systems that would demonstrate the absolute unity of thought and being. While Kant himself remained committed to the critical limitations that prevent reason from achieving absolute knowledge, His emphasis on systematic unity provided the inspiration for subsequent efforts to overcome these limitations. The unity of reason in Kant's philosophy provides a model for understanding human rationality as a complex but coherent capacity that operates across different domains while maintaining consistent principles and ultimate purposes. This approach suggests that the apparent conflicts between scientific, moral, and aesthetic approaches to experience can be resolved at a higher level that respects the legitimate authority of each domain while revealing their underlying unity. Part 10. Legacy and influence. Kant's influence on subsequent philosophy has been both profound and pervasive, shaping virtually every major philosophical development since the late 18th century. His critical philosophy established new standards for philosophical rigor, while opening up new problems and possibilities that continue to engage philosophical reflection. German idealism emerged directly from attempts to overcome what later philosophers saw as unacceptable limitations in Kant's critical philosophy. Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel argued that Kant's thing in itself was either incoherent or unnecessary, and they developed systematic philosophies that attempted to show how consciousness could achieve absolute knowledge of reality. Fichte eliminated the thing in itself by arguing that the ego posits both itself and the non-ego through its own activity, making consciousness the ultimate ground of all reality. Schelling developed a philosophy of nature that attempted to show the identity of subject and object, mind and nature, at the level of absolute reason. Hegel created the most comprehensive system, arguing that reality itself is rational and that absolute knowledge is possible through dialectical development. While these idealist systems were later criticized for their metaphysical ambitions, they preserved and developed important Kantian insights about the active role of consciousness, constituting experience, and the systematic unity of reason. Contemporary philosophers continue to draw on idealist insights while generally accepting Kant's more modest epistemological claims. 19th century philosophy was largely defined by reactions to Kant, whether supportive or critical. Schopenhauer developed a pessimistic philosophy that accepted Kant's transcendental idealism while arguing that the thing in itself is will rather than unknowable. Nietzsche criticized Kantian morality as life-denying but preserved Kantian insights about the creative role of human consciousness in shaping experience. Analytic philosophy emerged partly through rejection of post-Kantian idealism, but it has gradually rediscovered the value of Kantian insights about language, logic, and the conditions of knowledge. Contemporary philosophers like P. F. Strawson, John Rawls, and Christine Korsgaard have developed neo-Kantian approaches to metaphysics, political philosophy, and ethics that preserve central Kantian insights, while avoiding what they see as outdated metaphysical commitments. Continental philosophy has maintained a more continuous engagement with Kantian themes, particularly through phenomenology and hermeneutics. Husserl's phenomenology can be seen as a radicalized version of Kant's transcendental philosophy, while Heidegger's fundamental ontology both builds on and criticizes Kantian insights about temporality and human finitude. Contemporary moral philosophy has been profoundly influenced by Kant's emphasis on autonomy, universalizability, and human dignity. Even philosophers who reject specific aspects of Kantian ethics often work within frameworks that preserve his basic insights about the importance of treating persons as ends in themselves and grounding moral obligation in rational agency. Political philosophy continues to draw on Kantian insights about republican government, international law, and cosmopolitan right. Theories of human rights, democratic legitimacy, and international justice often trace their philosophical foundations to Kantian principles about individual autonomy and universal moral law. Philosophy of religion has been shaped by Kant's distinction between rational faith and dogmatic knowledge, and his attempt to ground religious belief in moral experience rather than theoretical argument. Both liberal theology and secular approaches to religious phenomena often reflect Kantian insights about the relationship between faith and reason. Even philosophers who explicitly reject Kantian approaches often work within problems and frameworks that Kant established. The ongoing debates about realism and anti-realism, the nature of moral obligation, the possibility of objective knowledge, and the relationship between mind and world all reflect issues that Kant brought to philosophical prominence. Conclusion: the Copernican revolution in thought. As we reach the end of our journey through Kant's philosophical architecture, we can see why his work represents such a decisive turning point in human thought. Like Copernicus, who revolutionized our understanding of the cosmos by placing the sun rather than the Earth at the center of the solar system, Kant revolutionized our understanding of knowledge by showing that objects conform to our cognition rather than our cognition simply mirroring objects. This Copernican revolution solved fundamental problems that had plagued philosophy for centuries, while opening up new possibilities for understanding human experience, moral obligation, and aesthetic judgment. By examining the conditions that make knowledge possible, rather than simply assuming we can have direct access to reality, Kant established both the scope and limits of human reason in ways that continue to influence philosophical reflection. Kant's critical philosophy teaches us that human reason is both powerful and limited. We can have genuine knowledge of the empirical world through the cooperation of sensibility and understanding, but we cannot transcend the boundaries of possible experience to gain theoretical knowledge of ultimate reality. This limitation is not a defeat for reason, but rather the condition for its proper operation and the ground for preserving space for moral faith and practical commitment. The moral dimension of Kant's philosophy reminds us that human beings are not simply natural objects subject to causal determination, but rational agents capable of acting from duty and treating others with dignity and respect. This insight about human dignity and autonomy has had profound influence on political thought, human rights theory, and our understanding of moral responsibility. Perhaps most importantly, Kant's philosophy demonstrates that rigorous critical thinking and systematic philosophical reflection can illuminate fundamental questions about knowledge, morality, and human destiny without falling into either dogmatic certainty or skeptical despair. His example shows that philosophy at its best involves the patient work of clarifying concepts, examining assumptions, and tracing out the implications of our most basic commitments about knowledge and value. The questions Kant raised and the methods he developed for addressing them remain vital for contemporary philosophy and for anyone seeking to understand the nature and limits of human reason. In an age when both scientific knowledge and moral disagreement seem to be expanding rapidly, Kant's insights about the conditions and limits of rational inquiry provide essential guidance for navigating complex intellectual and practical challenges. As we continue to grapple with questions about artificial intelligence, global justice, environmental responsibility, and the relationship between scientific and humanistic understanding, Kant's critical philosophy offers both caution and hope. His insights remind us that human reason is powerful enough to unlock the secrets of nature and establish principles of justice, yet humble enough to recognize its own limitations and preserve space for mystery, faith, and wonder. The man who never traveled far from Königsberg created intellectual journeys that span centuries and continue to guide human thought. His quiet revolution in the realm of pure thought established foundations that remain solid even as the world around us transforms at unprecedented speed. In Kant's careful mapping of reason's territories, we find not just philosophical theory but practical wisdom for living thoughtfully in a complex world. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Kant's philosophy is that genuine intellectual courage involves not just the willingness to think for oneself, but the discipline to think rigorously and the humility to acknowledge the limits of what we can know. His famous motto, sapere aude, dare to know, remains as relevant today as it was in his enlightened age, challenging each of us to exercise our rational capacities responsibly while remaining open to the deeper mysteries that make human existence meaningful. In the end, Kant's greatest achievement may be showing us that human beings are neither gods who can know everything, nor beasts who can know nothing, but rational, finite creatures capable of genuine knowledge, moral responsibility, and aesthetic wonder. This vision of human dignity, grounded in reason and limitation, continues to inspire philosophical reflection and practical commitment to justice, truth, and human flourishing. The revolution Kant began in human thought continues to unfold, reminding us that the most important journeys are often the ones that take us deeper into understanding ourselves and our place in the grand architecture of existence. Part 11. Antinomies of Pure Reason. One of Kant's most ingenious discoveries in the critique of pure reason concerns what he called the antinomies, contradictory pairs of propositions that pure reason can prove with equal rigor. Think about the world as a totality. These antinomies reveal the inevitable conflicts that arise when reason transgresses its proper boundaries and attempts to gain knowledge of things beyond possible experience. Kant identified 4 antinomies that correspond to the 4 categories of quantity, quality, relation, and modality. Each antinomy consists of a thesis and antithesis that can both be demonstrated through apparently valid arguments, creating an intolerable situation for reason that demands systematic unity and consistency in its judgments. The first antinomy concerns the mathematical composition of the world. The thesis argues that the world has a beginning in time and is limited in space, while the antithesis maintains that the world is infinite in both time and space. Kant showed that both positions can be supported through indirect proofs that assume the opposite and derive contradictions. To prove the thesis, we assume the world is infinite in time, and show this leads to the impossibility of completing an infinite series of past events before reaching the present moment. To prove the antithesis, we assume the world has a temporal beginning and show this requires empty time before creation, which contradicts the principle that nothing can begin to exist without a determining cause in time. The second antinomy addresses the infinite divisibility of substance. The thesis claims that every composite substance consists of simple parts, while the antithesis argues that nothing composite consists of simple parts and nothing simple exists in the world. Both positions seem to follow necessarily from the concept of composition and the demand for complete analysis. The third antinomy involves the relationship between causation and freedom. The thesis asserts that natural causation alone cannot explain all appearances and that we must assume the existence of causation through freedom, while the antithesis maintains that everything occurs according to natural laws and there is no freedom. This antinomy directly confronts the apparent conflict between scientific determinism and moral responsibility. The fourth antinomy concerns the existence of a necessary being. The thesis argues that something absolutely necessary exists either as part of the world or as its cause, while the antithesis claims that no absolutely necessary being exists either in the world or outside it as its cause. This antinomy addresses traditional arguments about God's existence and the contingency of the world. Kant's resolution of these antinomies depends crucially on his transcendental idealism and the distinction between phenomena and noumena. For the mathematical antinomies, first and second, both thesis and antithesis are false because they wrongly assume that the world of appearances constitutes a thing in itself that could be given as a completed totality. In reality, the sensible world is only a series of appearances that can be extended indefinitely but never completed. For the dynamical antinomies, third and fourth, both thesis and antithesis can be true when properly understood. The antithesis correctly describes the phenomenal realm where everything is subject to natural laws, while the thesis points toward the noumenal realm where freedom and necessary existence might obtain. This resolution preserves both scientific knowledge and moral responsibility by locating them in different conceptual frameworks. The antinomies demonstrate that pure reason necessarily falls into contradiction when it attempts to treat the ideas of reason. the absolute totality of conditions for any given conditioned phenomenon, as objects of possible toima, knowledge. This failure is not accidental, but reveals the essential structure of human reason, which naturally seeks unconditioned completeness, but cannot achieve it within the bounds of experience. The resolution of the Antinomies thus supports Kant's broader critical project of limiting knowledge to make room for faith. By showing that reason cannot theoretically establish or refute the existence of freedom, God, or cosmic totality, Kant opens space for practical approaches to these ultimate questions while preserving the legitimacy of scientific knowledge within its proper domain. Part 12. The Transcendental Imagination. At the heart of Kant's account of knowledge lies one of his most mysterious and important concepts, the transcendental imagination. This faculty serves as the crucial bridge between sensibility and understanding, making possible the synthesis that unifies the manifold of sensation into the coherent objects of experience. Without this synthetic function, we would have neither unified consciousness nor determinate knowledge of objects. The problem that transcendental imagination solves concerns the fundamental heterogeneity of sensible intuitions and intellectual concepts. Sensible intuitions are particular, temporal, and manifold, while concepts are universal, atemporal, and unifying. How can these fundamentally different types of representations be brought together to produce knowledge? Kant's answer involves a complex process of synthesis that occurs at three levels: apprehension, reproduction, and recognition. The synthesis of apprehension involves the imagination's ability to run through and hold together the manifold of sensation as it is given in time. Without this synthetic activity, the temporal flow of sensations would remain a mere succession of unrelated moments, incapable of constituting unified objects of awareness. The imagination must actively combine successive moments into unified temporal wholes that can become objects of consciousness. The synthesis of reproduction allows imagination to recall and represent previous moments of the temporal manifold, even when they are no longer present to immediate awareness. This reproductive capacity is essential for recognizing objects as persisting through time and for identifying different appearances as appearances of the same object. Without reproductive synthesis, each moment of experience would be isolated and unable to contribute to cumulative knowledge. The synthesis of recognition involves bringing the reproduced manifold under concepts that allow us to identify what we are experiencing. This synthetic activity connects the temporal flow of sensations with the atemporal concepts of understanding, making possible the determinate judgment that this is a house or this is a tree. Recognition requires both the activity of imagination and the spontaneity of understanding working together. These three syntheses are ultimately grounded in what Kant called the transcendental unity of apperception, the necessary unity of consciousness that accompanies all my representations and makes possible the think that can potentially accompany any thought. This transcendental unity is not itself an object of experience, but rather the condition that makes unified experience possible. The transcendental imagination operates according to what Kant called schemata, temporal determinations that mediate between pure concepts and sensible appearances. The schema of a concept is not an image, but rather a temporal rule for producing images that correspond to the concept. For example, the schema of triangle is not any particular triangular image, but the rule for constructing triangular figures in time and space. Schemata make possible the application of categories to appearances by providing temporal interpretations of pure conceptual relationships. The category of causation, for example, receives its schema in the temporal rule of irreversible succession, while the category of substance receives its schema in the rule of persistence through temporal chain. The doctrine of schematism reveals the essential temporality of human knowledge and the crucial role of imagination in mediating between the different sources of representation. This temporal character distinguishes human knowledge from the intellectual intuition that Kant attributed to divine cognition, which would immediately grasp its objects without requiring sensible data or conceptual processing. Later philosophers, particularly Heidegger, found in Kant's account of transcendental imagination the key to understanding human finitude and temporal existence. The imagination's synthetic activity reveals that human consciousness is essentially temporal, and that our access to being is always mediated through the temporal structures of our own existence, rather than through direct intellectual intuition. Part 13. Kant's philosophy of science. While Kant is often remembered primarily for his moral philosophy, his account of scientific knowledge was equally revolutionary and continues to influence philosophy of science today. Kant's analysis aimed to explain how mathematics and natural science are possible while avoiding both empiricist skepticism about necessary knowledge and rationalist overconfidence about metaphysical insight. Kant argued that genuine science requires synthetic a priori principles that are both informative about nature and knowable independently of particular empirical observations. Mathematics provides the paradigm case of such knowledge, offering universal and necessary truths about spatial and temporal relationships that apply to all possible objects of experience. Geometry, according to Kant, is possible because space is the a priori form of outer intuition rather than a property of things in themselves. This means that all objects of outer experience must conform to spatial relationships, making geometric truths universally applicable to empirical phenomena. Similarly, arithmetic is possible because time is the a priori form of inner intuition, ensuring that all temporal processes follow mathematical rules of succession and duration. Natural science depends not only on mathematical principles but also on what Kant called metaphysical principles that determine how empirical concepts must be applied to yield genuine scientific knowledge. These principles, developed in the metaphysical foundations of natural science, show how the pure categories of understanding receive specific scientific interpretation. The principle of the permanence of substance, for example, requires that in all change of appearances, substance neither increases nor decreases but only alters its accidents. This principle makes possible the scientific concept of matter as that which persists through all physical transformations and provides the foundation for principles of conservation in physics. The principle of temporal succession, according to causal law, requires that all alterations occur according to the law of cause and effect, making possible the scientific search for natural laws that connect events in universal and necessary relationships. This principle distinguishes genuine science from mere empirical description by requiring systematic causal explanation. The principle of the simultaneity of mutual interaction requires that substances that coexist in space must stand in relationships of mutual influence, making possible the scientific understanding of physical systems as unified wholes rather than collections of independent parts. These metaphysical principles bridge the gap between pure transcendental philosophy and empirical natural science by showing how a priori concepts must be applied to yield determinate scientific knowledge. They establish the conceptual framework within which empirical investigation can discover specific natural laws, while ensuring that such laws possess the universality and necessity that distinguish science from mere opinion. Kant's philosophy of science anticipated many later developments in scientific methodology and philosophy. His emphasis on the active role of mind in constituting scientific objects prefigured later constructivist approaches to scientific knowledge. His analysis of the relationship between mathematics and empirical science influenced later reflection on the role of mathematical modeling in physical theory. However, Kant's specific claims about Euclidean geometry and Newtonian mechanics as synthetic a priori truths were challenged by later developments in mathematics and physics. The discovery of non-Euclidean geometries and the development of relativity theory suggested that Kant was wrong to treat particular mathematical and physical theories as necessary features of any possible experience. Contemporary philosophers of science have responded to these challenges in various ways. Some argue that Kant's general approach remains valid, even if his specific examples need revision. Others develop neo-Kantian approaches that preserve his insights about the mind's contribution to scientific knowledge, while allowing for more flexibility in the specific principles that govern scientific inquiry. Part 14. The Sublime and Aesthetic Experience. Kant's analysis of aesthetic judgment in the Critique of Judgment introduced revolutionary insights about the nature of beauty and the sublime that continue to influence aesthetic theory and criticism. His approach differed from earlier aesthetic theories by focusing on the subjective conditions of aesthetic experience rather than objective properties of beautiful objects. The judgment of beauty involves 4 distinctive characteristics that distinguish aesthetic experience from both theoretical knowledge and practical evaluation. First, beautiful objects are appreciated disinterestedly, meaning we find them pleasing for their own sake, rather than for any purpose they serve or any desire they satisfy. This disinterested appreciation distinguishes aesthetic pleasure from both sensual gratification and practical utility. Second, aesthetic judgments claim universal validity, even though they are based on subjective feelings rather than objective concepts. When I judge something beautiful, I expect others to agree with my judgment and regard disagreement as mistaken rather than merely different. This universality distinguishes aesthetic judgment from mere personal preference while acknowledging its subjective foundation. Third, beautiful objects exhibit purposiveness without purpose. They seem designed for our cognitive faculties without serving any definite end or function. This apparent design creates harmony between imagination and understanding that produces aesthetic pleasure. But the harmony is appreciated for its own sake, rather than for accomplishing any particular goal. Fourth, aesthetic judgments feel necessary rather than arbitrary or optional. Beautiful objects seem to compel our aesthetic response in ways that make disagreement feel like a failure to perceive properly, rather than a legitimate difference of opinion. This necessity distinguishes aesthetic judgment from casual preferences while acknowledging its non-conceptual foundation. The experience of the sublime involves a different kind of aesthetic judgment that confronts us with our own limitations while revealing our supersensible capacities. Kant distinguished between the mathematical sublime, which involves magnitude, and the dynamical sublime, which involves power or might. The mathematical sublime occurs when imagination encounters objects so vast that it cannot comprehend them as unified totalities. While imagination fails in this task, reason recognizes its own capacity to think infinities that exceed all sensible measurement. This recognition of reason's superiority to sensible limitation produces a complex aesthetic experience that begins with displeasure at imagination's inadequacy, but culminates in pleasure at reason's transcendence. The dynamical sublime occurs when we encounter natural forces so powerful they could destroy us physically, while recognizing our moral independence from natural determination. Storms, earthquakes, and other displays of natural might reveal our physical vulnerability while simultaneously awakening awareness of our capacity for moral resistance to natural forces. Both forms of sublime experience involve what Kant called negative presentation, the attempt to present ideas that exceed the capacity of sensible imagination. The sublime thus points beyond the sensible world towards supersensible realities that can be thought but not intuitively grasped. Kant's aesthetic theory had profound influence on Romantic literature and art, which embraced his insights about the sublime and the creative power of imagination. The Romantic emphasis on individual genius, creative spontaneity, and the limitations of rational analysis reflects Kantian themes about the relationship between aesthetic experience and human freedom. Contemporary aesthetic theory continues to engage with Kantian insights about the autonomy of aesthetic judgment and the relationship between beauty and moral feeling. While few philosophers accept all aspects of Kant's aesthetic theory, his emphasis on the subjective universality of aesthetic judgment and the connection between aesthetic and moral experience remains influential. Critics have questioned whether Kant's analysis of disinterested appreciation adequately captures the political and social dimensions of aesthetic experience. Feminist and post-colonial theorists argue that Kant's emphasis on universal validity reflects particular cultural assumptions rather than universal features of aesthetic judgment. Part 15. Education and Enlightenment. Kant's views on education and enlightenment reveal the practical implications of his critical philosophy for human development and social progress. His essay, What is Enlightenment?, articulates a vision of intellectual maturity that remains relevant for contemporary discussions about education, democracy, and critical thinking. Enlightenment, according to Kant, is man's emergence from his self-imposed tutelage, the courage to use one's own understanding rather than relying on external authorities to think for oneself. This intellectual independence requires both the ability and the willingness to examine beliefs critically, rather than accepting them simply because they are traditional, authoritative, or convenient. The process of enlightenment involves overcoming what Kant called the laziness and cowardice that keep people in intellectual dependence. It is easier to let others think for us than to undertake the difficult work of critical reflection, and it is more comfortable to accept established authorities than to risk the uncertainty that comes with independent judgment. However, enlightenment cannot occur simply through individual effort, but requires social and political conditions that protect freedom of thought and expression. Kant distinguished between the private use of reason in official roles and the public use of reason as a member of humanity addressing the human community. While individuals must often conform to institutional requirements in their professional roles, they must be free to criticize these same institutions in their capacity as rational beings seeking truth. This distinction allows Kant to support both social order and intellectual freedom by requiring conformity to legitimate authority in specific institutional contexts, while protecting the right to public criticism that makes institutional improvement possible. A soldier must obey orders during battle, but should be free to criticize military policy in public discourse. A tax collector must enforce tax laws, but should be free to argue for tax reform. Kant's educational philosophy emphasizes the development of autonomous critical thinking rather than the mere transmission of information or the inculcation of particular beliefs. Education should help students learn to think for themselves rather than simply preparing them to accept established authorities or perform specific social functions. This educational approach requires balancing discipline with freedom, guidance with independence, and respect for tradition with openness to criticism and change. Students need enough structure to develop intellectual habits and skills, but they also need enough freedom to practice independent judgment and creative thinking. The goal of education is not simply individual success or social conformity, but the development of rational autonomy that enables students to contribute to human progress through critical thinking and moral action. This requires cultivating both intellectual virtues like clarity, consistency, and evidence-based reasoning, and moral virtues like honesty, courage, and respect for others. Kant's vision of enlightenment extends beyond individual education to encompass cultural and political transformation. Progress in human affairs depends on the gradual development of institutions that protect freedom of thought and encourage rational discourse about public questions. This institutional development requires enlightened individuals who can think critically about social problems while working cooperatively towards solutions. The relationship between education and enlightenment reveals the social dimensions of Kant's individualistic philosophy. While moral autonomy ultimately depends on individual rational capacity, its development and exercise require social conditions that protect and encourage critical thinking. This insight connects Kant's educational philosophy with his political theory and his vision of historical progress. Contemporary educational theory continues to engage with Kantian insights about critical thinking, moral education, and the relationship between individual development and social progress. While few educators accept all aspects of Kant's approach, his emphasis on rational autonomy and critical inquiry remains influential in discussions about educational goals and methods. Part 16. Kant's Anthropological Philosophy. In his later works, particularly Anthropology from a pragmatic point of view, Kant developed a philosophical understanding of human nature that complemented his critical philosophy by examining human beings as they appear in empirical experience rather than as pure, rational agents. This anthropological approach provided a more concrete and practical perspective on human capacities and limitations. Kant distinguished between physiological anthropology, which studies human beings as natural objects affected by external causes, and pragmatic anthropology, which examines human beings as self-determining agents capable of shaping their own development. Pragmatic anthropology focuses on what human beings make of themselves rather than what nature makes of them. This pragmatic approach revealed that human beings are fundamentally social creatures whose rational capacities develop only through interaction with others. While the moral law binds each individual as a rational being, the practical realization of moral ideals requires cooperative social institutions and shared cultural development. Kant identified what he called the unsocial sociability of human nature, the tendency to seek society for mutual benefit while simultaneously competing and conflicting in ways that threaten social cooperation. This tension creates a productive dynamic that forces the development of legal institutions, moral culture, and rational discourse that gradually promotes human flourishing. The anthropological perspective also revealed the importance of imagination, emotion, and embodiment in human experience. While the critical philosophy emphasized the rational foundations of knowledge and morality, the anthropological approach acknowledged that human beings are not pure rational agents, but finite creatures whose rationality is always embodied and contextualized. Kant's analysis of human temperaments, character types, and cultural differences provided a more nuanced understanding of human diversity while maintaining his commitment to universal rational principles. Different individuals and cultures may express their rational nature in various ways, while remaining subject to the same fundamental moral obligations and cognitive constraints. The pragmatic approach to anthropology also influenced Kant's views on gender, race, and cultural development in ways that reflected the limitations of his historical context. While his emphasis on rational dignity provided resources for challenging inequality and oppression, his specific empirical judgments about human differences sometimes contradicted his own moral principles. Contemporary scholars have criticized Kant's anthropological writings for reproducing prejudices about gender and racial differences that conflict with his commitment to human equality and dignity. These tensions reveal the ongoing challenge of applying universal rational principles to concrete historical circumstances while avoiding both abstract idealism and uncritical empiricism. However, Kant's pragmatic anthropology also provided insights that remain valuable for understanding human development and social progress. His analysis of the relationship between individual rational capacity and social institutional development anticipated later work in sociology, psychology, and political science about the social conditions that promote human flourishing. The anthropological dimension of Kant's philosophy reminds us that rational autonomy is not an abstract ideal but a concrete achievement that requires appropriate social conditions and ongoing cultural development. This insight connects Kant's philosophical system with practical questions about education, politics, and social reform that remain relevant for contemporary efforts to promote human dignity and rational freedom. Conclusion: the enduring revolution. As we conclude our exploration of Kant's philosophical architecture, we can see how his critical revolution continues to shape human thought more than 2 centuries after his death. the quiet professor from Königsberg fundamentally transformed how we understand the relationship between mind and world, reason and experience, freedom and nature, in ways that remain intellectually compelling and practically relevant. Kant's greatest achievement was demonstrating that human reason is both more powerful and more limited than previous philosophers had recognized. More powerful because it actively constitutes the structure of experience and establishes universal principles of knowledge and morality. More limited because it cannot transcend the conditions of human finitude to achieve absolute knowledge of things as they exist independently of our cognitive capacities. This insight about the scope and limits of reason provides essential guidance for navigating contemporary intellectual and practical challenges. In an age of information overload and ideological polarization, Kant's emphasis on critical thinking and intellectual humility offers resources for distinguishing genuine knowledge from mere opinion, while remaining open to perspectives that challenge our assumptions. The moral dimension of Kant's philosophy remains equally relevant for addressing questions about human rights, global justice, and our obligations to future generations. His emphasis on treating humanity as an end in itself provides philosophical foundations for challenging exploitation and oppression, while his vision of moral progress offers hope that reason and goodwill can gradually overcome prejudice and conflict. Perhaps most importantly, Kant's critical philosophy demonstrates that rigorous intellectual analysis and systematic philosophical reflection can illuminate fundamental questions about human existence without falling into either dogmatic certainty or skeptical despair. His example shows that philosophical thinking at its best involves the patient work of examining our most basic assumptions about knowledge, morality, and meaning while remaining humble about what we can ultimately know and achieve. The questions Kant raised about the nature of knowledge, the foundations of morality, the possibility of freedom, and the prospects for human progress remain as urgent today as they were in his enlightened age. His methods for addressing these questions through careful conceptual analysis and systematic critical reflection provide tools that remain valuable for anyone seeking to understand the human condition in all its complexity and possibility. In our current age of rapid technological change and global interconnection, Kant's insights about human dignity, rational autonomy, and cosmopolitan justice offer both inspiration and guidance for creating institutions and practices that respect human freedom while promoting cooperation across cultural and national boundaries. The revolution in thought that Kant initiated reminds us that the most important journeys are often those that lead us deeper into understanding ourselves and our place in the grand scheme of existence. His critical philosophy teaches us that human beings are neither gods who can know everything, nor beasts who can know nothing, but rational, finite creatures capable of genuine knowledge, moral responsibility, and meaningful progress toward truth and justice. This vision of human dignity, grounded in reason and limitation, continues to inspire philosophical reflection and practical commitment to the values that make human life worthwhile: truth, justice, beauty, and the ongoing effort to understand ourselves and our world more clearly and completely. The man who never traveled far from home created intellectual journeys that continue to guide human thought across centuries and cultures, reminding us that the greatest adventures often begin with the simple but profound question: what can we know, and how should we live?